Page 84 in your textbooks, as we take a look at your homework from last night, you did numbers 31 and 35 on page 84. And number 31, you were given the equation to graph y equals -2 times the cosine of x. Normally, I'll use function notation. They did not use that here. So, of course, in that case, we'll use a y-axis and an x-axis, much like we were accustomed to from our younger days, back when you weren't old and decrepit and breaking arms and such. And so, anyway, had to get that in. And so we set up our graph grid, and all that stuff that you did last night for homework. And as we look at this, I always like to start by considering what are the key points of the curve. It is cosine, so what are my key points, Quentin?
1, 0, -1, 0, 1.
Then I'll ask myself, what changes do I make to this curve? Well, what kind of changes do we see here, Jamie? There's two of them.
The invert.
We're going to invert everything, so that changes all the signs.
Then turn all the ones into 2s.
And it changes the, what's this called, class?
Period.
No, the amplitude. It changes the amplitude to 2 for everything. So we start at -2, then we go to 0, then up to +2, then back to 0, and then down, I should say 2 pi, not 2, and down to -2. And of course, if you wanted to double your square root of 3 over 2s to get square root of 3s, and double your 0.5s to get 1s, you could do that. Or you could just do your best, and I would say curve down here, and curve here, and then maybe retrace that top portion of the curve to curve down, and curve something like that. So you can kind of eyeball it, or you can actually take time to plot the extra points. Just make sure it's a nice, smooth curve. How many had something like this for number 31? Questions? You did the sine. All right, no, lovely. For number 35, we had y is equal to the negative sine of 2/3 x. Well, here again, there are two changes we're going to make to the sine curve, but let's start by getting our key points. Chris?
0 and 1, -1, 0.
There we go. And the first change that we see, Ethan?
Amplitude.
We're not changing the amplitude. The amplitude is still 1. We're going to invert everything, right? So that makes this negative and this positive. The other change that we see
is
if it comes in front of the x, we represent it with the letter...
Okay, it's 2 over 2/3, so 3 pi.
There we go. It ends up being 3 pi. 2/3 x becomes a period of 2 pi over b. To answer the question I asked a moment ago, that's represented by the letter b. Remember y, or we usually say f of x, is equal to, and this is new from yesterday, Chris, in the last lesson, positive negative v, there's your vertical shift. Positive negative a, there's whether or not you invert and your amplitude, either sine or cosine. B, there's your period change, and then x minus plus h, there's the horizontal shift from yesterday. Well, here we have the coefficient of the x is the b, so 2/3 or 2 pi over 2/3 does give 3 pi. So I'm going to need a little bit more space on the graph grid here. We're going to go to 5 pi over 2, and then right here would be 3 pi, so we just managed to make it. And we're going to start, remember, at 0.
How did you get 3 pi?
2 pi divided by 2/3. Remember, we take 2 pi over 1 and we multiply by the reciprocal, 3/2. Cancel the 2 and 2, and there's your 3 pi. So we're going to start at 0. We're going to end at 0, and halfway in between we're going to be at 0. Halfway in between here and here, we're going to be at -1. And halfway in between here and here, we're going to be at +1. And then again, if you wanted to get other key points, you're welcome to try it, or you could just try to connect with as smooth a curve as possible. You should have gotten something like this for number 35. How many had that for number 35? Question?
No, I did between 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi.
Oh, you ended up with 3 pi over 2. So instead of 2 pi over b, you did pi over b. Gotcha. Okay. Questions, comments on that? All right, flip back now to page 81. Excuse me, page 89. I can't read. Page 89. And on this page, we have numbers 25 and 28. So we've seen inversion twice. We've seen a period change. We've seen an amplitude change. Let's see a couple other changes as we move to the next graph grid here. And number 25, we had y is equal to the sine of x minus pi over 2. I said anytime something is grouped with the x, added or subtracted, but grouped with it, it's going to shift the graph class forward or backward, horizontally. This is the h. But the minus plus, remember, is to remind you that's backward of what we're used to seeing, so the sign is backward of what you'd expect. We would normally expect that a negative would shift negatively, but a negative shifts positively, the positive shifts backward. So we're going to shift our entire graph forward. How far, class?
2. Or
Pi over 2. We're going to shift the whole thing forward, pi over 2.
Three boxes.
So it's just 3 boxes, right?
Yeah.
So we have our, and again, they used y, so I'll use y here. And so pi over 2 is where I'm actually going to start. And I suggested drawing an f of x prime axis, or in this case, a y prime axis. It's not a real axis, but it gives us the ability, remember, to kind of reset a little bit here. And everything else about the curve is normal, right? The only change in the whole problem is just this forward shift pi over 2. Otherwise, we use the same key points as always, class.
0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0.
So we're going to start at 0, 3 boxes later, up to 1, down to 0, down to negative 1, back to 0. Notice we're ending pi over 2 later as well, just the whole graph shifts. And we'll connect with a smooth, a continuous curve as possible, and something like that. How many had that for number 25? Okay, good. We all got that one. Questions on that one? All right, and then for number 28, we had y is equal to 1 plus the cosine of x. And again, here the only change is that there's a constant that's been added to the curve. Amplitude, remember, is multiplied. The vertical shift is a separate term completely. And here, positive class shifts up, negative shifts down. Well, in this case, the 1 is an understood positive. So it's going to shift the whole graph up 1. Now remember, 1 is technically 2 boxes, but it's going to shift the whole graph up 1. So the suggestion here was to draw a new x prime axis. And so now this is my new quote-unquote origin. So when I graph my cosine key points, class,
1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1.
I'm going to go up 1 relative to this point. So up 1. 3 boxes later, we're at 0. 3 boxes later, negative 1. 3 boxes later, 0. 3 boxes later, 1. Relative to this axis. It's not a real axis, but it's it's just there for reference. And there's our cosine curve. What we're used to seeing has just been shifted up 1 level. And there we go. How many had this for number 28? Questions on number 28? Questions at all on this? If it's a separate term, class, it is vertical shift. If it's multiplied, it's the amplitude. The sign of the amplitude tells you whether or not to invert. The coefficient, the thing multiplied by the x, determines the period, which will be
2 pi. Or 2 pi over
2 pi over b, there we go. And then if there's something grouped with the x, subtracted or added, that's our horizontal shift, where a negative shifts forward and a positive shifts backward. Quick refresher for you as well, if we happen to have something like this, f of x is equal to negative 5, negative 2 times the cosine of 3x minus pi over 2. Make sure this all shows up on camera. Just made it. Good. Well, here, several things we notice. First of all, we see that the vertical shift is
negative 5.
down 5 units. We also see the graph is going to be inverted. We see that the amplitude is going to be 2. We know the key points are going to be
1, 0, negative 1, 0.
Oh, yeah.
But we're not ready to determine either period or horizontal shift because the x has to fly solo. The coefficient would have to be factored out of the grouping. So here I'd have to first factor out the 3, and when I do pull a 3 out of a 3x, I get, but when I pull out a 3 out of a negative pi over 2, I get negative pi over 6. You're dividing the 3 out. So my period here is going to be,
3 pi over 2.
careful,
2 2 pi over 3.
2 pi over 3. 2 pi over b. b is the 3. And then my horizontal shift is going to be,
Negative pi over 6.
but negative tells me which direction.
Forward.
So I'm going to shift forward pi over 6, which happens to be 1 box. So heaven forbid I had to graph this thing. I would go down 5, put a new x prime axis here. I go forward 1 box. Here's my new y prime axis, and this is my origin now, right? And so this is where I'm going to start, but my key points are all inverted and change to an amplitude of 2. So I would have to start at negative 2 and end at negative 2 pi over 3 later. Well, 2 pi over 3 is right here. Well, shifted forward 1 box here. So I have to start at negative 2, end at negative 2. Halfway in between, I'd have to have a, relative to this, positive 2. And then halfway in between those, zeros, and so the curve would be something like that. Questions on this? Clear to us, except for a clean sheet of graph paper and a pencil and an optional calculator if it makes you feel good.
My
It makes you
graph
feel-
paper is in a notebook. I can't tear it out.
Oh, yeah. Mine is too.
Failures, all of you. Okay, I'll give you graph paper.
Slobs.
Chris,
Slob,
you're not even taking
unfit
the
to
quiz.
live. Oh, he is taking it. He just doesn't have to count for him. Though the exam will count, so
I'll go paper.
it's okay. I feel generous. All right.
So what is it mean? Paper, this, pencil.
Paper, pencil, graph paper, pencil, calculator, everything else away. If you're watching on YouTube, we are going to take quiz 11. So if you'll go ahead and get ready to start on that, I'll give instructions. Then I'm going to end the video. That'll end part 1 of the lesson, and we will resume the video when it's time to begin our exam review. Obviously, this is, in a way, exam review because this is going to be on the exam. So I want to make sure we've got this down really well. First and last name at the top of your graph paper, along with today's date, which is 10/8/21. 10/8/21, today's date. And this is quiz 11.
Doing like an ACT, as you can see, put it in individual boxes. So it's supposed to be done.
All right. To the best of your ability, use the quiz copy as the cover sheet. Let's talk through the quiz very quickly. Numbers 1 through 5, you're going to answer questions about that equation or that function. You are not going to graph that function. Are we clear? 1 through 5, you're not graphing, you're just saying what would you do with that function. Then number 6 through 10, what would you do with that function? Make sense? Then number 11, I would go ahead and graph that on the front side of the graph paper below your questions that you've answered. I would turn the graph paper over and graph number 12 on the back. Okay, so you're going to graph 2 functions, but they're not the 2 that are in bold at the top. They're there for numbers 11 and 12. Any questions before we begin? All right, go and get started on quiz 11.